At the heart of the galaxy, where stars glittered like shattered diamonds across endless black, the Central Coalition Council gathered on Caltris Prime, a station so massive it cast its own light across nearby moons. Inside the Dome of Accord, 1,000 alien delegates sat in rows, their scales, feathers, fur, or polished exoskeletons gleaming under pale blue lights. The mood was light, almost mocking, as the agenda moved to the long-standing ban on human participation in coalition affairs. Ambassador Juran of the Vixari, a sleek, silver-skinned species known for their elegance and arrogance, stood with a lazy grin curling across his sharp face. "Why even discuss the humans?" he said, his voice soft but edged like a blade. "They're impulsive, emotional, unpredictable, barely more than beasts with clever fingers." A wave of laughter echoed through the chamber, some trying to be polite, others fully amused. It was a familiar routine. Humans were a joke. The ban had been passed quietly almost 70 years ago after a few early incidents, scuffles in trading ports, a diplomatic misstep or two, and one famous case where a human captain saved a mining colony by blowing up his own ship, violating at least 10 protocols. Since then, they were quietly pushed out of meaningful interstellar roles, left to their own corner of space. Few argued, few cared, until now. When the laughter faded, a soft voice spoke up. Ambassador Ellen Darrow of the Cathari, a species known for neutrality, reason, and memory. She stood slowly, her long white robes swaying like mist, and raised a small hollow crystal in her four-fingered hand. "Esteemed delegates," she said, her voice clear and quiet, yet drawing attention like a sudden silence in a storm. "I ask the Council's indulgence. I have footage recently declassified, submitted by survivors and independent observers. It concerns Outpost Vela 7 and humanity's role in an event we believe to be a total loss." The room stirred, confused. Vela 7. That was the outpost attacked by the Solari Phantoms, a species so deadly and so strange. Most documents about them were sealed. The outpost was presumed destroyed, its final signals garbled and marked as corrupted. "With permission," Ellen added, "I would like to show you 7 minutes of recovered footage." Juran's smirk returned. "What's the point? A human drama? A noble failure?" But Council Chair Vathari, a crystalline entity that shimmered in 12 colors, inclined its faceted head. "Show us," it said, and the lights dimmed. A projection flickered to life at the dome's center. The feed was shaky, static-ridden, then it cleared. Gas clouds choked the screen. Fires burned along the corridors. The outpost looked more like a dying creature than a station. The camera shifted, and suddenly a human face appeared, young, smeared with ash, blood on her brow. She dragged another being behind her, an Otaric engineer whose tendrils trembled in pain. The human barked orders to others as they scrambled to seal a bulkhead. Explosions rang in the distance. Another human, older, limping, tossed a fire suppressant canister through the flames. The feed cut again, resumed on a different corridor. A dozen life forms, including several alien species, crouched behind an overturned table as power flickered. A voice over comms, crackling but calm, gave instructions. "Medbay is down. Redirect oxygen from sublevel 4. Anyone who can walk, help me reinforce the east corridor. We are not leaving anyone behind." The camera panned to show humans working side by side with wounded allies, one carrying a child of the Thrin species in his arms. As the footage rolled, the laughter that had filled the room earlier died. Now the delegates leaned forward. The humans weren't retreating. They were fighting to keep others alive with no reinforcements, no backup, and no escape. When the screen faded to black, Ellen stepped forward again. "That," she said quietly, "was just the first hour. The full footage runs 6 hours and 13 minutes. Every moment of it contains acts of courage, intelligence, and selflessness. Much of it is painful, some of it is miraculous, but none of it, none, deserves laughter." A heavy silence settled over the chamber. Even the breathing of the scaled Koraki was quiet. Ambassador Juran opened his mouth, but no words came out. Ellen's voice broke the silence again. "You banned them because you feared what you couldn't. predict. Because their history is messy, because their methods are strange. But perhaps it's time to ask not what they did wrong, but what they did right when no one else would have stood their ground. She held up the crystal again. This is only part of the record. I offer it not as judgment, but as evidence. Of humanity, not perfect, not polished, but capable of standing where others fall. Her words lingered like a note struck in a quiet room. She turned, sat down, and said nothing more. The lights brightened slowly. The next name on the agenda was called. No one answered. The council dome remained quiet even after the lights returned to full glow, as if the very air held its breath. And when the session resumed the next cycle, more seats than usual were filled. Delegates who normally sent aides now sat in person, curious and uneasy, waiting to see the next piece of footage Ellen Darrow had promised. And when she rose again with the same calm expression, she held a new hollow crystal, silver and pulsing with stored memory. And the moment she placed it into the projector, the lights dimmed without a word, as if even the station itself wished to listen, and the screen lit up to show the shattered wreckage of Outpost Vela 7, no longer under attack, but moments before it all began, orbiting a cold gas giant with rings that shimmered in the background. And the outpost looked peaceful, quiet, with its docking bays half lit and its corridors mostly empty. But then, without warning, the camera view shifted. Alarms blared, red lights flashed, and voices shouted across the comms as an incoming ship, unidentified and silent, came into view, drifting like a ghost toward the station. And within seconds, shields were raised, protocols activated, but the ship didn't stop, didn't answer, didn't even slow down. And then it hit them with a burst of unknown energy, and every screen went black for 7 seconds, the footage cutting out as systems crashed, and when it came back, chaos ruled. The Solarii Phantoms had arrived, creatures of shifting form and jagged motion, hard to see clearly even on camera, like light was afraid of them, and they poured into the outpost through torn bulkheads and melted seals, striking silently and without warning, while Vela 7's crew, barely 80 souls, a mix of humans and aliens, rushed to respond, and in those first horrible minutes, 9 were lost, including the commanding officer, leaving a young human lieutenant named Markel Vance suddenly in charge. And he didn't panic, didn't shout, just tapped his communicator and ordered the fallback plan to initiate. Rerouting all emergency systems to the lower decks where most survivors were gathering, and the footage showed how the humans moved, fast, coordinated, working in pairs, dragging wounded, patching leaks with emergency sealant, while others fought back, using energy tools and even scrap metal when weapons failed. And the camera caught one moment where Vance himself pulled a Zalari nurse from a collapsing tunnel just before it caved in, tossing her clear and crawling out through sparks and smoke. And though the power flickered, one hallway security feed kept rolling, showing a small group of humans holding a barricade, none trained soldiers, just maintenance workers and a medic. But they held firm, using flashbangs and pressure valves to disorient the enemy long enough for a civilian shuttle to escape from. Dock 4, and that shuttle, as Ellen explained softly from her seat, carried 17 lives, including 5 children and a pregnant Theron, who later gave birth aboard a cargo hauler en route to safe space. And as the camera shifted again, it followed a group moving through the dark, flashlights cutting narrow beams through smoke, led by Vance and 2 engineers, who manually restarted the fusion core cooling system after the auto controls had been fried by the Solari's first strike, and the footage showed them crawling through vents and flooded compartments, sharing oxygen masks, even as one of them collapsed from exposure. And still the others carried on, leaving no one behind. And every new angle of footage only deepened the tension in the room where it was shown, alien ambassadors no longer sitting back in boredom, but leaning forward, breathless, some with their eyes wide, some with clenched hands, watching as humans they had once dismissed worked without rest to keep others alive, even those not of their own kind. And when the footage reached the moment where the lower decks were breached and the main medical bay was overrun, it was a human crew member, a soft-spoken research assistant, who triggered the secondary blast doors and locked herself inside with the attackers, saving over 30 who were behind her. And her final moments, captured on a nearby maintenance drone, were silent, as she simply nodded once toward the camera, before the door sealed and the image went white with light. And even Jurin, who had mocked humans openly, sat with his jaw tight and his eyes shadowed as the recording neared its end, where the remaining crew, led now by a wounded Vance, transmitted one last signal using a scavenged relay and a hand-built amplifier, sending not a call for rescue but a full data packet of everything they had learned. Solari tactics, weaknesses, energy signatures, all of which allowed future colonies to create defenses that worked, something no coalition team had managed before. And Ellen let that silence stretch as the screen faded to black, then stood and looked slowly around the dome, her voice soft yet firm as she said, "The station should have fallen in the first hour, but it stood for 13. And no one laughed now. No one dismissed her, because the footage had spoken louder than pride, and the unshakable truth hung heavy in the air, that humanity, so long ignored, had done something none of them expected, and the room full of powerful races and proud voices now sat quiet, their thoughts turned inward, their judgments shaken, and as Ellen took her seat once more, the council chair gave no signal to resume the agenda, because no one was ready to speak after watching what should have been a disaster become a story of stubborn courage and impossible survival. The next session began with the same quiet tension that had settled over the council like a heavy fog. And although none said it aloud, something had changed since the first footage was shown. Curiosity had turned into discomfort, and discomfort into a strange kind of respect. And as Ellen Darrow stood once more, holding another hollow crystal between her long fingers, she spoke only a few words before starting the next video, saying, "This is what happens when humans find those others have left behind." And the chamber lights dimmed again as the screen flickered to life, showing the broken halls of Outpost Vela 7 from a new angle, this time not from the humans' point of view, but from a forgotten section deep within the station, where 6 members of a Kalari science team had hidden themselves inside a maintenance pod after the attack began, their voices recorded in short bursts of panic, speaking in hushed tones, afraid even to breathe too loud, and their faces told the truth. These were not warriors, not soldiers, just researchers and technicians who had been caught in the wrong place, left without weapons, without a clear path to escape, and they had tried to reach the evacuation shuttles, but the corridors had already fallen, the lights had failed, and the strange shifting forms of the Solari moved through shadows like living knives, so the Kalari did what most would, hide and hope, sealing themselves inside the pod with only enough air for 12 hours, and the feed from inside the pod was quiet at first, filled with short messages to family, quiet prayers in their native tongue, and long stretches of silence, until a faint noise echoed outside. Metal dragging across metal, footsteps, and one of them whispered, "They're here," expecting the worst, expecting death, but instead, a light clicked on outside, flashing in a steady, deliberate pattern, the universal code for friendly contact, and a voice crackled faintly through the sealed hatch, speaking broken Kalari. "Stay calm. I'm human. I'll get you out." And even through the fear, the researchers stared at each other in disbelief, not sure whether to trust it. But then the pod shook as something outside was pried loose, and light streamed in as the hatch opened, revealing a single human in bloodied armor, helmet cracked, carrying a stolen coalition plasma cutter in one hand and a hand-scrawled map in the other, and though he looked like he had been through a storm, his voice was steady, his eyes clear, and he didn't waste time. "Follow me. Stay low. We go now," he said, and they did, too stunned to argue, crawling out behind him into a corridor half lit by fire and flickering lights, and the footage followed their escape through multiple security drones left on auto record, showing how the human, later identified as Sergeant Eli Grant, led the 6 Kalari down twisting side routes, avoiding main paths where Solari movement had been detected. And when one of the scientists tripped and twisted a leg, Grant didn't stop. He simply picked them up and kept moving, not slowing down, not giving up, even as his own limp worsened with every step. And once, when the group reached a junction where 2 Solari forms blocked the way, Grant used a discarded metal rod and a noise beacon to lure them away, running into the dark while the others waited in breathless silence, only for him to return 2 minutes later, bruised and bleeding, but still guiding them forward, and the Footage captured the group reaching an access ladder that led to a pressure lock, where the last functioning escape pod remained. And with shaking hands, Grant entered the override codes, shoved the Kalari inside, sealed the hatch, and slammed the launch control just as another tremor rocked the station, and the pod fired away into space, safe, while he collapsed against the wall, alone again, as the alarm systems began their final countdown. And Ellen Darrow spoke then, her voice low, saying, "The Kalari Council sent a team 3 weeks later to recover any remains. They found his body near the core, holding a datapad with logs of every life sign he'd tracked, every injured ally he tried to reach, even as the walls fell around him. And the footage ended there, the screen black, the silence sharp, and no one spoke, not even Jurin, who looked down at his folded hands as if ashamed, while a Kalari ambassador, until then silent, stood and addressed the chamber in a clear voice, saying, "The hospital built in our northern colony is named Grant's Reach. Our children learn his story before they learn the names of our moons." And no one questioned the truth of it, because they had seen what words could not explain. What it meant for one person to walk into danger not for glory, not for gain, but because others were afraid and someone had to lead them out. And in that quiet, heavy chamber full of powerful species, there was now an unspoken shift, a turning in the wind. Because the old belief that humans were too wild, too dangerous, too flawed, no longer stood strong under the weight of what they had just seen. And as Ellen stepped down once more, she left the crystal on the central table, where it glowed, faintly in the dim light, a silent reminder of the kind of courage that doesn't come with medals, only stories whispered by those who were saved. The chamber was darker than usual when Ellen Darrow returned for the 4th time, and though she carried no speech, no written words, she held a crystal brighter than the ones before, glowing a deep amber like captured fire, and when she placed it in the projector slot without a word, every delegate leaned forward, already knowing this would not be easy to watch, for the crystal held what coalition analysts had long believed lost forever: Outpost Vela 7's final broadcast, the message that should never have reached anyone. The transmission sent as the station was collapsing from within, and as the projection flared to life, the screen showed a command deck drenched in smoke and sparks, with alarms crying in the background and metal groaning like something alive, and standing in the center of it all, bloodied, burned, and half-collapsed, was Lieutenant Markel Vance, gripping the edge of a cracked console with one hand and holding a makeshift comlink in the other, his uniform torn and eyes rimmed with soot, but his voice steady as he spoke into the camera, not knowing who would receive the message or if it would survive the signal decay, only knowing he had to try. And he began with the station's designation and coordinates, his tone like a soldier giving a report, even as the ceiling shook above him, and he listed names of surviving crew members who had made it to escape pods, followed by names of those confirmed dead. But then his voice faltered, not from fear, but from something heavier, and he looked down, took a slow breath, and continued, saying that most systems were gone. The Solari had breached all major sectors, and there were no more safe paths, only blocked routes and fires and failing pressure seals. Yet a few dozen remained trapped near the lower medical wing, too injured to move, and he had stayed to reroute what little power remained to that section to give them oxygen and time, though he knew it wouldn't be enough. And as the camera trembled again with another internal blast, he looked into the lens, not like a man saying goodbye, but like someone trying to explain something too big for words, and he said, "We were never supposed to be here, I know that. We're the backup crew, the ones the coalition barely noticed. Most of us were rotated here because we didn't fit anywhere else. But we stayed, we fought, not because we were brave, because no one else was coming." And behind him shapes moved, 2 humans dragging power cables through broken panels, another sealing event with melted steel, their motions slow but determined, and Vance looked back once more, his face pale. Now, his voice fading, but he added, "If anyone finds this, I want you to know, we didn't fall running. We stood where we were. We held the line." And with those final words, he reached out and activated the relay, forcing a burst signal through a failing long-range node, using every ounce of power left in the core, and the feed crackled, cut, then briefly resumed from a distant satellite showing a bright flare in the distance, Vela 7 burning as its main reactors collapsed, and then it was gone, signal lost forever, except for that one recording, recovered later from the far edge of a debris field by a human scavenger ship that had ignored the Coalition's warning beacons and gone looking anyway. And when Ellen Darrow ended the playback, the silence in the council dome was not just respectful. It was shaken, heavy, as if something deep had been moved, and many delegates looked down at their hands or stared at the floor, unwilling to meet each other's eyes, for the truth had grown too large to ignore, and even Jurin of the Vixari, who had once scoffed at the idea of human courage, now sat silent with his claws clenched, unable to speak, and Ellen said only this: that message was not meant for glory. It was meant to warn, but it did more than that. It showed who they truly are, not perfect, but present when it matters most. And she stepped down without waiting for a reply, leaving the crystal in the projector like a beacon still burning. And the council, for once in its long and talk-heavy history, had no speeches to give and no debates to offer, only a silence that stretched far longer than protocol allowed, because every being in that chamber now knew that humanity, banned and dismissed for decades, had not asked to be tested. But when the test came, they answered not with fear or retreat, but with fire, grit, and the quiet, steady voice of a man who stayed behind so that others could live. The council dome had never been this quiet for so long, and when Ellen Darrow walked into the chamber again, something had shifted, not in her, but in the way the others looked at her, not with scorn or boredom, but with an uneasy kind of respect, and some even with guilt. And this time she brought no glowing crystal in her hand, only a small black box, smooth and simple, which she placed gently on the central table without a word, and after a few moments, a hologram emerged from it, not shaky footage or emergency recordings, but a still image of a name carved into stone, surrounded by flags from many worlds, and below it dozens of people stood in silence, many of them not human, their heads bowed, hands folded, some weeping softly, while soft wind rustled through what appeared to be a garden built among ruins. And Ellen spoke then, saying, "This is what remains of Vela 7, now called the Vance Memorial." And as the image shifted to show more, rows of names carved into black glass, benches shaped like the escape pods that launched in the final hours, and a flame that never extinguished, she continued in a quiet, firm voice, "But this story is not just about who died. It is about how the galaxy began to remember," and the screen changed again, showing footage from across dozens of worlds. A young Frelky child reciting Markel Vance's final words at a school ceremony, a Jurelian priest lighting a candle under a newly raised human banner, a mining station naming its emergency wing Grant's Path, and a Theran medical ship bearing the title Unity 7, its logo formed by 6 species who had once refused to speak to one another, now joined by a single memory. And then came a broadcast clip that caught everyone's attention, recorded only a month earlier, showing a high-ranking Coalition admiral standing at a podium with dozens of alien leaders beside him, all wearing simple black bands on their arms as he read from a newly signed agreement, stating that humans would no longer be banned, no longer silenced, and instead welcomed back into the Coalition as full members with all rights and protections. And while many in the chamber had known this was coming, none had expected it so soon. And as the clip ended, the chamber remained still until Ellen's voice broke the silence again, saying, "There is something else I must show." And she touched the box again, this time projecting a short, rough recording made not on a ship or station, but from a human colony that had received Vance's final message through broken relays and slow satellite drift. And the woman in the video, an old technician with metal braces on her arms, stood in front of a battered screen, playing Vance's final words over and over, and she whispered, "He said no one else was coming. So we did." And behind her stood a crowd of humans, all volunteers, all armed and armored, ready to board a convoy of old, patched-up ships marked with symbols of hope, not war. And as the video faded, Ellen said, "That convoy saved 4 settlements from Solari attack before the Coalition forces arrived. They didn't wait to be allowed back. They answered the call anyway, and that hit harder than any speech ever could because it showed something the Council had feared to admit. Humanity didn't need permission to do what was right, and their strength was not just in muscle or firepower, but in this deep, stubborn need to stand when others fall, to protect when others flee, to return even after being cast out. And now their names were being remembered not with suspicion, but with honor. And Ellen ended her presentation by opening the black box fully, revealing a medal forged from the hull of Vela 7 itself, shaped like a simple shield with no weapon on it, only a torch, and she said, "This was sent by the survivors of the lower decks. They asked that it be placed in the Hall of Unity, not to remind us of what we lost, but what we nearly turned away." And she stepped back, saying nothing more, letting the weight of her words and the image of that lone medal carry the moment. And in the long silence that followed, one by one, members of the Council stood, not because they were told, but because they chose to, and no one forgot the name Markel Vance after that. No one joked about humans again, and across the stars, more stories began to surface, of other outposts, other sacrifices, until the phrase "held the line" no longer belonged to one man or one station, but became a symbol, a truth that could not be erased, a name remembered in every corner of space where someone stood for another, even when the odds said they shouldn't, and now, even the stars seemed to carry that echo. Whispers of a people once banned, now returned, not with anger, but with fire, and a promise that they would not let the galaxy fall, not while they were still standing. The Council dome felt different now, as if the very walls remembered the stories that had been told within them. And when Ellen Darrow stepped inside for the final time, she carried nothing, no box, no crystal, no recordings. Only a folded sheet of paper clutched tightly in one hand, and as she reached the center table, the quiet was complete, every seat filled, every eye fixed on her, waiting. But she did not speak right away. Instead, letting the silence stretch as her gaze moved across the chamber, stopping briefly on each ambassador who had once scoffed at the idea of human valor, then she unfolded the paper and began to read, not from a report, but from a letter, written by a child, barely 10 years old, who had survived the fall of Vela 7, rescued by a human soldier whose name was never known, and in the simple handwriting were the words, "I was scared and I thought I was going to die, but he picked me up and told me not to cry. And he said the door wasn't closed yet, we just had to find the right one." And the letter ended with, "When I grow up, I want to be like him. Not because he was strong, but because he stayed." And as Ellen folded the page again, she looked around and said, "The door, counselors, is no longer closed." And with that, a low hum filled the room as the great side doors of the dome opened, and in stepped a group of humans, not warriors in armor or soldiers with medals, but diplomats, engineers, and medics, ordinary men and women, invited back for the first time. In over 20 years, their expressions calm, alert, proud, though some clearly fought emotion in their eyes as they saw the chamber that had once cast their kind out, and leading them was an older man with gray hair and a limp, wearing a uniform marked not by rank, but by the emblem of Unity Fleet, the volunteer group that had protected colonies during the crisis, and he walked with purpose toward the center of the chamber until he stood beside Ellen, offering only a short nod, and the Council did not shout, did not argue. They rose, slowly, each of them, not by command, but by choice, offering the gesture of recognition long reserved for honored guests, and as the human delegation took their seats, a new voice filled the chamber, Chancellor Varel of the Theron, who had once voted most strongly for the human ban, now stood to speak, her voice steady but low, saying, "We were wrong," and her words echoed like thunder through the great hall, not because we did not see danger, but because we refused to see courage. And then she paused, looking toward the humans as she added, "Today, we open the door again, not just for return, but for rebuilding, together." And the room held its breath as Ellen turned back to the table and placed the folded letter at its center, beside the old black medal, and a new symbol appeared above the table, glowing and spinning slowly, a merged sigil of human and coalition. Flags with the torch from Vela 7 burning at the center. And as it rotated, soft voices filled the chamber from hidden speakers, recordings from survivors across the galaxy, repeating a simple phrase in many tongues. They came back, they stayed. We remember. And that moment would be written into every history book across the known worlds, not just as the day humanity rejoined the coalition, but as the moment the door truly opened, not by force or fear, but by the steady light of stories that could no longer be ignored. And across the stars and colonies, both rich and poor, ships began to change their markings, adding the unity torch beside their homeworld crests, and schools began teaching the history not from above, but from inside, through the voices of those who lived it. And a new generation grew up knowing that courage came not only from grand speeches, but from hands reaching out in the dark, from footsteps taken when no path was clear, and from doors opened not by keys, but by truth. And as the council session ended and the chamber slowly emptied, Ellen Darrow stood alone for a moment, watching the last light fade from the hologram, and she smiled, not because the battle was over, but because the story had been heard, and sometimes that was enough to change everything.